The pace of change in shipping creates challenges to ensure contracts are up to date and relevant. In the latest chat about geopolitics and trade episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, Punit Oza, founder of Maritime NXT, talks to BIMCO about developing new contracts and ensuring commercially workable solutions.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and welcome to another episode on Chat about Geopolitics and Trade, what I fondly refer to as my Chat GPT. And today it's an honor and a privilege to have Stinne Taiger Ivø from BIMCO. She's the Deputy Secretary General of BIMCO. And I think that BIMCO has, in my opinion, over the 30 plus years of my industry experience, played a very vital role in standardizing contracts, in making sure that it responds to the changes that are happening. And those changes are not just regulatory, industry related, they are very much geopolitical changes as well. And I think BIMCO has done an amazing job in terms of what they're doing. But I would like to talk more to today's Stinne about what is it and how is it that BIMCO goes about doing it. So welcome, Stinne, to my episode on Chat about Geopolitics and Trade.
Thanks very much, Punit, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this podcast.
So basically, we can start right away with the first question about BIMCO. BIMCO has effectively been around. I know that this next month you're celebrating your 120th anniversary of
Yes,
BIMCO. So congratulations in advance for that.
thank you.
It has historically evolved as a massive voice in industry. It has actually also been kind of at the forefront of some of the key changes which have actually evolved with the industry changes, but also with the world as it has evolved. So if you can take us a little bit through the historical evolution of BIMCO as an ownership organization and then now into more kind of a, let's say, a global body that it has become, representing a certain practical voice of shipping, as you call it very fondly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Punit. And there's definitely a story there to be told, also because we are turning 120 next month and we'll celebrate it accordingly. But it would have changed quite a bit from the outset and to where we are now. And I think, first of all, when we started drafting standard contracts from the outset, then it was more or less only charter parties and bills of lading. That was sort of the main focus from the outset. Dry cargo charter parties and other standard charter parties. But then that gradually evolved to be a much more broader scope where we expanded to not only cover charter parties, but also grew into a broader representation of not only segments, where we talk about tankers, bulkers, but also offshore and containers as well, but also management agreements. So ship managers were also getting one of the focus points where we developed our standard ship management contract, and also new building contracts, ship recycling contracts, and other types where it was more sort of the, well, you can say from the whole span of where the shipping industry will need standard contracts and clauses. So that became not only much broader, but also, I think gradually BIMCO cemented its position as being the developer for the industry of standard contracts and clauses. So the attention to BIMCO and the role that BIMCO took in this space, that also grew stronger and stronger. And then what we have seen lately, I think, is also partly a bit a shift in not only having an owner's perspective as it was from the outset, but actually aiming for something that is a bit more balanced. Because what really is our strength is that our contracts and clauses are used. We want them to be used in the industry, by the industry, and that the uptake is convincing when we publish a new contracts and clause. And if it's too one-sided, one way or the other, then that will be a problem for that party trying to agree or get agreement from the other party to this new contract or clause. So we would aim for having it more balanced, so it's more easy actually to negotiate and for both parties to actually quicker agree on that this is a fair and thoroughly thought through solution. And then a final point I'd like to also mention, which I think is also changed from when we look back and to where we are now, and that is the pace of the developments worldwide and also in particular when it comes to regulations. So there are a lot of new regulations coming into place. There's also a lot of changes in the world, as you're also pointing out from the outset around geopolitical, that climate will change. And then we need, as an organization, and also to stay relevant, to be able to produce new solutions where there is a need in the industry to respond differently because of these changes. So that pace is definitely not slowing down, rather the opposite, that we need to be quick to respond.
Absolutely. And I think you are keeping up as best as you can. I think the pace is simply outstripping the need and the speed at which things can change, because the industry is quite wide and vast and quite complex. So it does require a very different tact. I mean, let's get to the focus area, which is kind of the one that you emphasize, really the documentary committee, the committee that really is at the heart of what you guys do in BIMCO. And I had the absolute pleasure and privilege to work with Inga Freusa, who was heading that committee for many years, because I was in Klaveness and she was a chief legal counsel. And when she used to come back from these documentary committee meetings, she was extremely invigorated. She was really refreshed with the kind of conversations that were actually happening. And that was the first time I realized that it's actually a committee made up of countries, similar to literally the IMO or the United Nations. It was not companies that really came in, but they represented countries, and they actually have a very detailed way of presenting these perspectives. So if you can just take us through a kind of a process of creating these committees, the subcommittees which look at individual contracts, how do you actually, after having the process of creating that contract, look at disseminating that through a series of, I know, awareness meetings as well as awareness seminars and reach outs, and I've attended quite a few of them recently for Gen Con especially. And finally, how do you promote adoption? Because the real challenge in the industry is about making sure that what you are producing is actually used and adopted, and that is something which is very interesting. So if you can take us through a very quick overview of this documentary and subcommittees, it'll be fascinating, because I think it's a process which I have known intimately through both Nick Fell recently as well as in earlier Avatar. I feel that it's something which needs to be highlighted and brought out. So please go ahead and give us some perspectives on that, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Punit, and thanks for the question also, because I think now you have had the privilege also knowing a bit more in detail about our processes, but actually I don't think it's commonly known how we actually develop our contracts and
Yes.
clauses. So I'll try to make it brief and then make a description of how does it actually start and where does it end when we embark on a new project. So we start with the documentary committee, as you say, and that is a large body where we have many countries. We have about 27 countries represented, and they will have a member appointed, but also a substitute. So sometimes we even have more representatives from one country. But of course, they are in a way representing their country, and they may actually also discuss with other owners charters in that same country to get more feedback when they are preparing for a documentary committee meeting. But as such, they are also individual experts. So what we really aim for when we have these documentary committee meetings, that is that everybody would share their knowledge and their expertise and actually comment on the drafts that we have either up for adoption or up for review, because collectively there is a lot of expertise in that room. Also, we have our club members there, that includes the IG clubs, but also we have some of the national associations. So there is a lot of voices there coming from different backgrounds, different segments. So that is a way whereby we ensure that we have a high quality and that also we have commercially workable solutions out there once they get published. So everything starts with a DC, and that is the same for what we call a mandate, and that is actually the you can say the green light to start on a project. So it's not the secretariat sitting and thinking we'll just do this or we'll do that. We have ideas, we follow the market closely, of course, ourselves, but we would also bring it to the DC and saying, what do you think about this idea? Is that what we should embark on next, or is it more in this direction? What is needed? So there's a close dialogue there around new projects. So the DC will give green light.
Before you go on, I just wanted to reconfirm that the DC membership, although it's country specific, the people who are members are actually shipping professionals working for shipping companies, isn't it?
Yeah, correct.
This is a crucial difference in my mind because I know the fact that Nick Fell, who chairs the committee now, was the representative for Singapore. So he was bringing in the perspective from not just BW where he was working, but also the fact that he was bringing the Singapore perspective from a shipping perspective.
Yes.
And I think it's a very powerful point because while having national representation, in reality, it is actually commercial national representation which comes into the documentary committee, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, you're completely correct on that.
And that's a very unique feature because unlike the other United Nations, for example, which have more political undertones, this is purely commercial, business related, shipping related, maritime related people who actually talk about the needs of the industry right up front.
Yes.
And that's where the mandates are drawn up. Please go ahead. The mandate comes in and then you're green lighting a project and then what happens? Yeah.
What we will then start doing, that is to put together a subcommittee that can start developing that contract or clause as it may be that has been mandated. Of course, we do many projects at the same time, but then just talk about it from an individual point of view. Then that depends really what it is, what type of contract or clause that we are embarking on. If it's something that will be useful for the managers, which could be shipmen and crewmen, or a clause that would go into ship management contracts, then of course we would put the subcommittee together by inviting a group of managers and a group of owners. And then often we will also have a club representative, one from an P&I club, and then a lawyer, often a trained English lawyer there. It's not always like that, but that's often how the subcommittee will look like. We try to keep them relatively small, and we do that with the purpose to actually have the clauses developed with the speed that we need in order not to have it too delayed out to the market. And the fewer calendars to coordinate, the easier it gets. And then when they start working and they will prepare the first draft, that subcommittee, then we will also make use of sounding boards. So keeping the subcommittee small, then sort of to balance that, to make sure, as you say, that we have the industry perspective and that it gets the uptake that we are aiming for once published, then we'll send it out to a larger group in order for the other industry players that might be relevant. It's not everybody, but it's a larger group than the subcommittee, to test whether the subcommittee is on the right track, etc., and get even more perspective in. And then the subcommittee will continue its work, and we will of course also in that process send it to the DC, to the documentary committee for review, and that can be several times or it can be faster, and only maybe sometimes once if it's a more simple clause. And as you say, it's a good point sort of on the DC, that what we try is really to have some commercially workable solutions.
Right.
So we are not aiming for something that is very legalistic or very lengthy. It still needs to be legally sound and it needs to be compliant with English law, as it often is,
Yep.
but it should not be driven by a very sort of legalistic point of view, but rather something that is commercially workable. And then eventually that finalized draft will go to the DC, and then the next process for the DC will then be to adopt the contract or the clause.
Sure.
And then it gets published with our explanatory notes. And our explanatory notes have also developed over time. So we are being quite explicit about explaining what was the intention behind that clause, behind that contract, behind that specific subclause. So we go through in very detail and comment on most of the subclauses in a contractual solution there.
Yep.
And also sometimes put some guiding elements, because again, keeping it relatively lean, and sometimes they still end up being quite comprehensive, the clauses we produce. Then we will also sometimes point to features where we decided in the subcommittee not to include them in the clause, but still aspects that market players may want to consider depending on which segment they are operating in.
Sure.
So they are also quite helpful. And then, as you say, then we would organize promotion activities, and that can be both physical events where we host a seminar and one location to actually explain about it in person. It can also be a webinar. It can also be a small news piece explaining a bit more detail, or what we're also going to work a bit more to produce. That is some explainer, some small videos explaining about the content. So that's the process as a whole.
Absolutely.
One thing that's also overall arching in this whole process, that is that we are composing the subcommittees in a way in the same manner as a DC, although small. And by that, I mean we try to draw on our global membership. So we compose the subcommittees with members from different regions.
That's a very interesting point that I see after you explain the process. I think it's a very evolutionary process which actually evolves in terms of starting from the industry pain points and ending up solving the industry pain points. But I would like to point out and reconfirm again with you that you start with a smaller group of people because the DC is predominantly or is made up of the members of BIMCO. So an example would be BW being members of BIMCO would then have Nick there representing BW, or Oldendorf represented by whoever is representing Oldendorf, but they are in Germany or they are in Singapore country-wide delegation of or the membership of DC. Once you actually get to the subcommittees, you open this up a little bit, isn't it? You actually go to even non-members because you bring P&I clubs, you bring lawyers, and you bring experts who may be not members of BIMCO, but they're there only for the subcommittee level understanding and expertise. Is that correct?
Well, we would still put the subcommittee together from our big pool of BIMCO members.
Okay.
So it will be very unusual for us to invite anybody to the subcommittee to participate if they are non-BIMCO members.
Okay.
It has happened. It could happen again.
Right.
It may be that that particular non-BIMCO member would have that crucial expertise that we would need for a certain clause or contract to be developed. But generally, also the P&I clubs, as well as the lawyers, they are members of BIMCO.
Right.
So they are not owner members, as you say, but they are still BIMCO members.
Okay.
And in that sense, we will still consider them as members.
Yeah. So effectively, you are looking at basically them being associate members.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you open it up to a larger audience and then the adoption comes in. Now, one of the things that technology has managed to do, Stina, is also able to track a lot of these adoption measures, especially with your smart contracts. You're able to get a lot more information and data about how much adoption is actually happening, how much usage is actually happening in the industry of these forms. And do you see that trend becoming more and more positive over a period of time, and technology also coming in a bigger way? I know that that's a big part of the focus of BIMCO going forward as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. We have good tools to monitor on our SmartCon platforms, the charter party editor, which forms are being more used than others on SmartCon. So it depends a little bit also on the market and also the tradition in a particular segment. But we can see that there are a growing number of customers actually also going to the SmartCon platform and editing their and sort of concluding their charter party on SmartCon. But we're also monitoring the visits we get to our website, because the clauses are also on SmartCon, so you can get the clauses sort of into your charter party if it's a new clause that is not part of the charter party as from the outset, for example. But then we can also visit our website just to see visits from our members and the industry perspective when it comes to having a look at new clauses, because they will still be easily accessible and available on our website.
Absolutely. And that's very true, because I think that's one of the things I wanted to highlight, that technology is now being used in a greater manner across the entire industry.
Yeah.
And from a geopolitical perspective, earlier you used to actually have to ask your brokers or look at seniors in your company to ask them about what clauses were existing in previous contracts. You had a lot of manual processes out there, but today, with the geopolitical changes happening so quickly,
Yeah.
you can very quickly verify which are the relevant clauses which are interesting.
Yes.
And that brings me to the next question, which is most interesting for me, is you've had some amazing success in terms of, creating clauses which are specifically related to geopolitical aspects. I remember many years ago, we had the Triton Lark case, and the courts actually came up and talked about the convoi time clause, and we actually had to change that clause. But the speed at which, of course, I think Inga was one of the reasons why that happened very quickly, because she was involved. But in generally, I think she pushed and said, okay, let's get a change done, because there is a need for the clause to be updated, because based on the case that have just happened, we needed to update that. So the responsiveness of BIMCO has been quite phenomenal. I know recently Soren earlier told me about the fact that the Russian oil price cap clauses being consistently updated because the situation was changing constantly, and you actually updated it quite a number of times in a very short span of time. And you also had things like your sanctions clause, your piracy clause. A lot of these things were actually partly generated because of the court cases and interpretation of those clauses, but also by events which are happening. New sanction regimes are coming in, new aspects are coming in terms of how the force majeure, for example, needs to be updated. You've done a major success in trying to at least standardize the force majeure clause, which according to me is a very delicate and a very complex subject, but somehow you've managed to create some kind of a balance in there as well. These are all very relevant clauses when it comes to geopolitical changes. Geopolitical changes are not giving you any advance notice so that you can create clauses for it. You have to be very adaptive, responsive to the geopolitical changes and move with times very quickly. And you guys have done that. How do you see these clauses being changed and amended? Let's say, for example, you have a new development in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and you need to put in a new Black Sea grain clause, for example, or a grain trade clause and some kind of a security clause. Would you then approach the DC very quickly to go and form a subcommittee and do it fast, or are there fast track mechanisms available beyond what you have right now?
Yeah, very good point. And definitely what we have seen lately is that the world is changing quite rapidly when it comes to geopolitical aspects. So it has been needed in the recent years. And as you mentioned yourself, which is a good example of that, that is the Russian oil price cap scheme. So when the oil price cap scheme, when that was introduced, then we were quite quick. And that is exactly the mechanism as you there described, that we would approach the DC to get a mandate. And that can be done quite quickly. It can also just be done by writing to the DC member and explaining the need instead of waiting for the next meeting, and then put a subcommittee together and then start developing it, and then also deal with it online, sort of in terms of either online meetings or just by email. So we can do a lot via correspondence, and the DC members, they are also very agile and responsive in that sense, because they would also have seen the same need.
Yes.
So that is possible to do something quite quickly. Now, particular with the Russian oil price cap scheme clause, that was also a bit unusual for us, because we did produce one in 23, I think, and then already in 24 we changed it. And that has to do with the fact that the mechanism there, the underlying sanction regime, that was changed, and it was changed so that the cost attestation requirements, they were getting a bit more specific, and we wanted to make sure that the clause that we had out there, that was also secure and what can you say, completely within scope and fit for purpose for that particular market, still going to Russia and then trading Russian oil on the price cap scheme.
Right.
So therefore we actually addressed it again and then produced an updated clause. So it can be really fast, and the same as you say with sanctions regime coming into force or different market conditions coming out of other aspects, then it is possible to produce something quite quickly. And actually, just as you mentioned as well, the Russian Ukraine war, we are these days we published our new updated war risk clauses, so convo time
Yeah.
25 and also Volvo 25.
Mm.
They've just come out,
Yep.
and they include some various updates whilst we are keeping intact the main features that is also the widely used and recognized fundamental aspects where it is for the owners to decide. So the owners will still have that decision where it's up to the master and the owners and their reasonable judgment to assess whether it's a dangerous route to go through, and whether that will put the vessel, the crew, or the cargo at danger.
Yep.
So those aspects they have kept in place, but then we have updated, as you say. We'll still have to always be aware of changes
Sure.
that may impact the parties, in the sense where we need to revise or update a certain clause.
Absolutely. Very interesting. I must admit, from a industry perspective, that having worked in the industry, I realized that because the DC members are predominantly industry professionals, seeing these challenges their ability to respond is faster because of the fact that they themselves need it.
Yeah.
They require it for doing the business themselves. So it's a literally kind of a win-win situation from that perspective. I know we are kind of running fairly close to the finish now, but I just wanted to specifically ask one question, which I always ask. As you imagine, I teach my course on geopolitical risks and impact on shipping now for the last 2 years in close to 12 business schools around the world, and I interact with close to 500 students a year. Obviously, part of that interaction is also a little bit to do with you guys in BIMCO, and it's really impressive in terms of you talking about the training part. But that's again something which I think is amazing what you do. But I really want to pick your brains a little bit about any kind of advice that you have for students, because all my students need to listen to these podcasts before they come to my classes. and and it's a great way for me to tell them that this is what the industry is thinking and this is what industry professionals are thinking, and potentially these are all students who might be looking at employment opportunities with organizations like yours in BIMCO. And what kind of advice do you have in terms of, if they need to look at BIMCO, they need to look at the future ready aspects of the industry? What skill sets do you think they need to actually have as a must have? There are soft skills and then there are, of course, hard skills and professional skills that they need. But in general, what is your opinion? And this can be your Stinne's opinion, it can be BIMCO's opinion. But what skill sets do you think you're looking at in the future ready professionals of the industry?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And really, it's good to think about. And we do that. We do have students, and it is something that we also think about. How can we interact, and the importance of having the next generation also wanting to go into shipping and taking part of this industry. So, definitely a very relevant question. And you can say, if I'm just looking from the contracts and clauses perspective, and more widely than that, actually, then of course, shipping being very international, then I'd say the interest in other cultures, the interest in other people, the willingness to engage with all different cultures, different nationalities, that is actually a must, because it's very difficult to be in shipping and BIMCO without having that appetite to really learn new people and also learn about new ways of doing things, because it will differ from country to country, even though the business itself, shipping itself, is very international. So that is one thing. Then I'd say the whole development, and for having the interest in contracts and clauses, then it's commercial skills. I should say they are important, but it can also be legal skills. It can be a mix. It doesn't need to be the same profile. Together, we will bring the competences that we need. And that goes for the DC, goes for the subcommittees, and even the secretariat. But of course, having legal skills, and that's also part of what you teach, and commercial skills as well. And then, of course, it's also diplomacy. When we develop our contracts and clauses, then it's important that we create consensus around the solutions. And sort of being in that seat as a secretary, you will also need a good portion of ability to find compromises. And that's, of course, something that we'll do together with the chairperson of that subcommittee. But that's also a skill to being a bit of a diplomat.
Absolutely. And I think you have a great opportunity. Also, the fact that BIMCO has evolved from just having offices in Denmark to now having offices all over the world. So, in reality, you're actually getting that 360-degree view globally, which is important. And that's a very important point that you mentioned. I always tell the students that unlike any other industry which talks about being global because of the fact that they do business with the rest of the world, we actually are global because we literally go and physically do business across the space. We actually travel to these countries around, and obviously every time you learn something with that. But again, as I said, my very first memory of BIMCO is with Peter Grube in 1993 when I joined Pressure Shipping, and I called him up about a charterer's background, and he told me that this company is a new company, but the person behind this company is actually somebody who's not a very good guy, and we keep a very close database of the people behind the companies and beneficial ownership as well as the actual name of the company. That taught me a very important lesson right from day one, that if you talk to people like BIMCO, they can actually give you information which is about the core or the crux of the business. And that is important because they are linked up to the arteries of the business through your members and everybody else that you deal with. So I have nothing but the highest admiration for the work that you guys do. But from a geopolitical perspective, I wanted to highlight in this episode that there's a lot of work that needs to be actually brought out, including the work of the documentary committee and the subcommittees that you talk about. But this is all that we have time for, Stinne. But I really, really appreciate your insights. I am hoping that more people know about the intricacies and the workings of BIMCO, because it is definitely worth highlighting. I'm sure my students would love to listen to this, and I'll be highlighting that to them in my lectures as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to participate.
Thanks a lot.